Hello and welcome back to Dev with Sev. I'm Sev the Dev, and today we will be continuing to build our character logic and implement jumping, enemies, and melee attacks. Let's dive into it. To implement jumping, we will modify the Y component of our rigid body's velocity, but we want to be able to check if our player is grounded so we can't jump infinitely. We are going to make a new private bool method called checkGrounded, and we are going to be returning a physics 2D .raycast, and we are going to pass for the first value the transform.position as our origin. Then we're going to do negative vector2.up as the direction. For the distance, we're going to do the grounded leeway. What this does is return false if no colliders are detected beneath the player, meaning they are airborne. Now in handled jump, we are going to check if we are attempting to jump, and if we are grounded. Then we're going to modify our rigid body's velocity by applying a new vector2, and we'll pass our current rigid body x velocity in the x component, and the y component will be our jump force. If we go into our game and let it load, then if we press play, we should be able to press space and see that our character jumps now. If you would like to visualize the checkGrounded raycast, then we can use the onDrawGizmos selected unity function. So we just need to go below fixed update here. We void onDrawGizmos selected. Then we only need to write debug.drawRay, and we're going to use the transform.position as our origin. And for the direction, we're going to do negative vector2.up and multiply it by our grounded leeway. And let's set a color, let's say green. Now if we save that, go back into the editor, let it load. Now if we click play, and then select our character, if we zoom into the scene, we should see this green raycast now below our character. And that is the checkGrounded raycast seeing if there's colliders beneath us. That's all the logic we need for jumping. Now we're going to create our enemies and set up our player's melee attacks. In the prefabs folder, we need to duplicate our character prefab. Hold Ctrl and press D, and then rename it to enemy. Go ahead and open up the enemy prefab. And now we need to switch out the light bandit sprite sheet. We can click and drag the heavy bandit sprite sheet, and we'll notice that we're really small. We need to go back to the heavy bandit sprite sheet and switch the pixels per unit to 32 and apply. Now we need to make the script for our enemy. Go to the enemy prefab, and at the bottom we can remove the player script. Under source, create a C# script and name it enemy. Now back on our enemy, we can go ahead and add that script as a component. Then right-click on enemy and edit script. Visual Studio will ask us to reload. Click Reload All. We will start by making our variables. We need a public float for our health pool, and we'll set that to 10 by default. Then we're going to need a public float for our speed, as we did in player, and that will also be set to 5. We'll need a public float for jump force, and that will be set to 6 like it was in the player. We'll need a public float grounded leeway, and that will be 0.1. And then we'll need a private float for our current health. Notice that we are using some code that player uses in the same way. This means that we should create a parent character class for player and enemy to inherit from. However, I won't be making the parent class until after we have these enemy and attacking systems working. Once we have them working, we will go back and refactor the character classes. For now, we're just going to add headers so they're easily identifiable in the editor. The first header will be for attributes, and the second header, like in the player, will be movement. In the start function, we need to set our current health equal to our health pool, or our maximum health. This is so our enemy will be instantiated with the correct amount of life. Now to check if a character can be damaged, we are going to implement an interface. Back in Unity, we need to go ahead and create a new C# script. Under Source, right-click, and Create, C# script, and prefix it with I, and name it damageable. It's prefixed with I because it's an interface. Now we can go into Visual Studio and click Reload All. Let's find our interface that we just made, and we'll have to make some adjustments to the class. Firstly, let's switch class to Interface, and we are no longer going to be inheriting from mono behavior, so we can get rid of Start and Update. And there's only one function we want to be implementable, and that will be a void, and we'll call it apply damage, and it will accept a float called amount. In our enemy class, we need to make sure that we are now inheriting from iDamageable, and then we can go ahead and implement its function by doing public virtual void and then apply damage. Now in this method, all we need to do is subtract the amount of damage from our current health. So we can do current health minus equals amount. Then we need to check if our current health is less than or equal to 0, or we've lost all of our health, we're going to go ahead and die. Now we haven't written this method yet, so let's go ahead and go below this and do private void die. And in here, all we need to do for now is let's set the game object set active to false. And then we can go ahead and destroy the game object. I've actually forgotten to add a semicolon at the end of where we call the die method. Don't forget to end your statements. Now we're done with the enemy script for now. We can go back into player, and we'll need to add a few variables for combat. Let's set up the header, and we'll name it combat. First, we'll need a public transform called our attack origin. This is where the attack will originate from. Then we'll need a public float called attack radius. This is how wide-reaching our attack will be. Then we need a public float for damage, a public float for attack delay. This will make it so we can't just outright spam our attacks over and over again. And then we'll need a public layer mask called enemy layer. And we'll set that to 8 for now. There's actually one thing I want to fix. Since our character is going to have melee attacking and ranged attacking at some point, we want to make our attack variables more specific. So instead of attack key, if you highlight that variable and hold Control and press R twice, it'll ask you to rename it in the project, and we are going to call it the melee attack key. Likewise for the other attack variables, for attack origin, it will be melee attack origin. Attack radius will be melee attack radius. Melee damage. Melee attack delay. And then this will be our attempt melee attack. Okay, so if we scroll through our code, we should see that it's updated in the areas that we use those variables. All right, so that's looking good. Before we make our melee attacking logic, we'll need a private float to track the time until melee readied. And this will be the time that it takes before we can successfully melee attack again. Now we can go down to our handle attack method and rename it as we did the variables to handle melee attack. And the first thing we want to check for is if we are available to attack. So if time until melee readied is less than or equal to 0, and if it's not less than or equal to 0, we want to set time until melee readied minus equal time.delta time. What this is saying is if our timer for our melee attack is less than or equal to 0, or it's finished, we can go ahead and attack. Else, we need to subtract the time since the last frame from the timer until it reaches 0. We also want to be checking if we are attempting to attack as well in this statement. Now we can just do a debug here to see if Unity detects we are attacking. If we go back into Unity and let it load, when we click play and then try to attack, we should get a log that we are attempting to melee attack. For our actual attack logic, we are going to use the physics2D method called overlap circle all. What this does is return a list of colliders within a radius. We are going to store that list in a collider 2D array, and we'll name that overlapped colliders. And we're using the physics2D overlap circle all. Now we need a point from where it originates, so we're going to use the melee attack origin dot position. Now we need a radius, and that will be our melee attack radius. And we're also going to do it on the enemy layer. Now we need to go back into Unity and let it load for a moment. Let's open up our enemy prefab, and under layer you'll see that it's default. We want to add a layer And under user layer 8, because we set our enemy layer as 8, we're going to name this enemy. And then we can go back to our enemy and switch the layer to enemy. And save that. Back in our player script, we need to now iterate through our overlapped colliders. We can do that with a for loop and saying I is less than overlapped colliders.length, which is the size of the array. Now we're going to check if the collider's object implements I damageable. So we can say I damageable enemy attributes and set that to overlapped colliders of I dot get component I damageable. And now we need to check that enemy attributes is not null. So if enemy attributes does not equal null, we're going to go ahead and apply damage. And we'll pass our melee damage. And finally, we need to activate our melee attack delay. So we can do time until melee readied equals melee attack delay. To visualize the attack area, we can add some lines to our onDrawGizmosSelected function. We are going to say if melee attack origin does not equal null, then gizmos dot draw wire sphere, and we are going to pass it our melee attack origin dot position and give it our melee attack radius. Back in the editor, we need to go ahead and open our player prefab. And we have to child a new empty game object to it, and we'll name it melee origin. And if we click on it, we want to position it so that it doesn't extend too far, but it is where our player should be able to melee attack. So right there will be fine for now. Back in our character, if we go down to the script, we'll see that melee attack origin has none. We want to drag the melee origin object we made in there. And we'll see the gizmo is now drawing now. And now that I see that, we actually want to move our origin a bit further back because it seems to extend a little too far. It also looks like the radius is a bit too large. So we'll lower that. Let's say 0.4. Okay, that looks good for now. Before we test out the melee, let's go ahead and double check that our player script is actually set to the enemy layer and not mixed. If it's set to mixed, you'll detect the ground and any other colliders you have in your scene. So let's go back to our scene. And now let's go ahead and drag in our enemy. And remember, our enemy has a health pool of 10, and our character has a melee damage of 2. So if we play, first let me swing off to the right, and we'll see that melee attack is being attempted. And we can see our gizmo here. Now let's place the enemy inside of that gizmo. Press attack. And now if we press attack 4 more times, it should kill the character. And the 4th time, there, our enemy is dead. That is all we are going to cover in part 2. In the next part, we will be implementing our ranged attack, as well as refactoring our existing code into a character script that player and enemy will both inherit from. Please let me know if you have any comments or suggestions down below. Thank you to everyone watching, This is Sev the Dev, and I will see you all in the next one.